I've realized recently that some of the videos I've been uploading have been quite similar in terms of content, so I'm just going to combine them into their own series. Welcome to episode something of In Hytale, where I go in depth on a specific piece of gameplay or mechanic in Hytale. And on today's episode, we're taking a look at dungeons. What's up guys, it's me Tween, welcome back to another video. Now before this video starts, I just want to say, hey, my name is Tween. I've been covering Hytale pretty much since the game was announced, so if you're interested in Hytale at all, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you're a real one. Now, what actually is a dungeon? Well, a dungeon by definition is a linear instanced area with custom environments, enemies, bosses, and rewards. What does that actually mean? Well, a dungeon is linear, which means the goal is usually to go from point A to point B, but in the middle they might throw a couple enemies and a couple bosses and stuff, but at the end you get custom rewards. Now, instance means dungeons are completely separate from the open world. While you might find the entrance to dungeons like walking around Orbis, you're not just going to dig straight down and suddenly reach the last boss of a dungeon ever. Now, dungeons are usually this big grand thing. They're kind of impressive and usually quite pretty, and they are usually handcrafted, so enemies or bosses are usually, in most games, created specifically to be placed in those dungeons, and they are unique to them. Now, what about dungeons in Hytale specifically? Well, since dungeons are completely instanced, Hypixel does have quite a lot of options for what they could do. They have three options here. The first option is handcraft every single dungeon from scratch. The pro of this is usually they'll look very consistent and very nice, and the experiences will feel very tailored, but they will be the same for every playthrough. Now, the second option here is just procedurally generate them for every world, which is honestly pretty good. You kind of get the same thing, but with a bit more variation. But the third option, which Hypixel does have the option to implement, is kind of make it like a roguelike type thing, where every time you enter the portal, it's a completely different layout. Now, for those of you who don't know what roguelikes are, basically they're a genre of game where every time you start from the beginning with nothing, and you kind of have to work your way up through a procedurally generated level to get to the end. Now, roguelikes have a lot of replayability. They have all these custom items and upgrades and stuff that you can find that make your playthroughs more varied on top of the procedural generation. Hypixel does have the option to add this, which could be really interesting. Now, one thing we do actually know for certain from a blog post, they were named as specifically portal dungeons. Now, what does this mean? How does this tie into Ultaverses? It's getting too confusing, okay? My brain is starting to hurt a little bit from all the stuff that's going to be in the game. Portal dungeons, that means they will be separate from Orbis itself, but portals gives them the option to make it completely separate from Orbis. While they could just place dungeons like really deep, or maybe like in the sky, somewhere I wouldn't actually normally be able to reach in game, but through portals it might make a bit more sense. That could be really interesting. They have so many options to place these wherever they want. This also ties into what I said about Ultaverses in my What is Ultaverses video. I assumed from that screenshot we had of Ultaverses that they would also be taken through portals. So maybe they're separate, maybe they're different. Hey, maybe I was completely wrong about Ultaverses being taken through portals. Maybe there's multiple uses for portals. How would they balance that? How would they place that in the world? I would love to speculate about that, but honestly, I have no idea. Portals could have multiple uses from what we know. This is crazy. I'm going in a bit too deep here. One thing that is interesting about portals is that there will probably be a load screen between them. Dungeons will be completely separate from the default world of Orbis, which means they have the option to kind of change the rules about in dungeons specifically. And one thing that leads me to believe is they will disable building in dungeons. They will be completely separate, and they do have the option to disable building in dungeons, because I feel like building blocks in dungeons would kind of ruin the whole thing. They would have to design each encounter to be able to destroy buildings or kind of counter them, so the players just can't just run away from them really easily. I feel like that would be a great option, just to kind of completely remove any like cheese that you could have with these dungeons, and kind of implement like cheat tactics for speedrunning and stuff. Because from the screenshot we have of dungeons, this screenshot right here, it looks very open. It looks like it takes place in like kind of a void area, like space or something, right? So if you could just build around the whole thing, it would ruin the entire experience, and they would have to design each and every dungeon around being able to build, and it would just kind of be a nightmare. So I think disabling building for these encounters would actually be a really good positive. It kind of limits your possibilities for tackling these dungeons, but in my opinion, just removing the ability to build in all dungeons kind of solves so many problems for the developer. I know it's not up to me to solve problems for Hypixel, but you know, if that was me, that would probably be how I design dungeons. Now, what about story ties? Since they are hand-picked, the story is also hand-picked, so they will probably design dungeons around like big story mode encounters like fighting Varen and stuff like that. That could be really, really crazy. But like, just imagine like a big epic final boss. You have to go through all these hard enemies with all the loot you've earned and all the friends you've made along the way, right? And you fight the big bad last guy and then you win, and then it's all cool. And it's all awesome. Then you unlock Ultiverses. You know what I mean? It could be kind of crazy, but I do think dungeons are a great way to tie in like massive story events into the game, have them separate from the open world so they don't really interfere too much, because when you're exploring the open world you can find story structures, so having like a really important one just kind of be in the open world for you to stumble upon might kind of ruin it. So I feel like saving massive moments for dungeons that you can repeat, so you can relive those moments if you want to, would be really cool. This one's kind of optional, but I also think these dungeons will have custom rewards and custom enemies. A lot of dungeons do. I know I showed the example of New World, but which isn't a good example because they reuse mobs like all hell, but these are very hand-picked. They have the option to just completely create original experiences from this, so I do think we will see some custom enemies in dungeons. Now, what about rewards? I do think rewards are going to be like that interesting, because just getting a drop from a dungeon or having to repeat a dungeon several times to get a specific reward in an RPG where you have all these crafting options, I don't think it's going to really be that engaging. I think dungeons aren't going to be necessary for progression. Maybe you'll get like a cool custom thing, but that's probably going to be where it ends for the rewards of that dungeon. I think after you get that item, maybe you're going to want to upgrade it in multiple ways. They will be kind of probably unique and probably a bit crazy and probably a bit nice, but getting that reward from that dungeon isn't going to be the end all of your progression, I don't think. Anyways guys, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you did enjoy. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a dislike if you disliked it. I may or may not upload a non-Hytale video. I kind of started this Hytale train just so I really wouldn't get much criticism or much like feedback, so just so I could get into kind of like the flow of things, kind of like the flow of doing this whole thing. So I think you're going to start to see that pay off with some non-Hytale videos, stuff that's more like designed for a wider audience. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a dislike if you disliked it, subscribe if you got this far and you haven't. If you got this far and you haven't, I mean, come on, you're probably going to like my other videos, so just subscribe and tap out. Peace. See ya.